The standoff in Ukraine is intensifying today with warning shots from pro-Russia gunmen fired to prevent an unarmed international military observer mission from entering Crimea. Plus new reports that an unarmed Ukraine border guards observation plane came under fire and no one was hurt. This morning, President Obama discussed the ongoing situation in Ukraine with European allies, making individual calls to the British Prime Minister, France's President Hollande, also having a conference call with the presidents of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. For more now, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, is joining me now. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate that because, sir, I understand you were in Ukraine during a period that was known as the Orange Revolution. That was during Yushchenko's presidency. How can what happened then guide with how to move forward now? Well,
the Yushchenko government came in by winning a fair election after the previous government tried to steal the election. And they came in with a great deal of goodwill, but unfortunately, they fell into fighting among themselves. Mr. Yushchenko was undermined by his then Prime Minister, Ms. Tymoshenko, and their fighting among themselves prevented them from spending time dealing with the urgent issues facing the Ukrainian people. So they lost their own legitimacy. And Mr. Yanukovych, who had tried to steal the election in 2004, won a fair presidential election, which Mr. Yushchenko conducted in 2010.
Okay, so then a delayed reaction there, but then the changing of the guard. Russia is currently warning, sir, as you know, that any sanctions that the U.S. tries to impose on Moscow over this crisis are going to hit the U.S., come back at them like a boomerang. So what role should the United States be playing? Are we playing the right one right now?
I think the president's policy is very good. Russia is actually afraid of sanctions. If the sanctions are put in place not just by the United States, but also by Europe, it will have a major effect. It would not just prevent senior Russian officials who are responsible for the aggression in Ukraine from traveling to Europe, it would also freeze their substantial assets that are in Europe. That's why I think the president probably called European leaders this morning to try and persuade them to institute both visa sanctions and financial sanctions.
Yes, and do something in a joint effort there. However, look, the Cold War is over. This crisis certainly causing a further showdown between Presidents Obama and Putin. Why does the outcome in Ukraine matter to the United States?
Well, we are supporting the choice of the people of Ukraine to have a free and a fair government. These demonstrations that began in late November were first against Yanukovych's decision to turn away from a trade agreement with Europe. But they quickly morphed into demonstrations against the increasingly authoritarian rule that Mr. Yanukovych was imposing with the approval of Mr. Putin. That is our interest, to help the Ukrainian people decide their own future. Mr. Putin does not want a Ukraine which is a democracy. He does not want a Ukraine which is interested in good relations with Europe. And the crisis we're seeing in Crimea is this naked aggression by the Kremlin is because Mr. Putin is unhappy that the Ukrainian people threw out Mr. Yanukovych.
All right, but how much might it matter if a majority of the people in Crimea want to secede from Ukraine? I mean, what are the international norms on something like this?
If that were to happen, that might be considered reasonable. But that's not what's going on. The ballot which has been produced for this referendum has two choices. The people in Crimea can vote for independence from Ukraine, or they can vote for annexation from Russia. They're not being offered the choice to vote for staying in Ukraine. It's worth remembering that 20 years ago, a little bit more than 20 years ago, in fact, there was a referendum in Ukraine. Should Ukraine be independent? Every region of Ukraine, including Crimea at that time, voted to be independent from Russia. The last census in Crimea was in 2001, 13 years ago. According to that census, 58% of the population of Crimea was Russian. Mm-hmm. That means that today there's less than 58% of the Crimean population is Russian, because the Tatar community is much larger today than it was then.
So then give me conventional wisdom on where this would go in terms of the vote.
Well, it's very simple. It's very simple. Mr. Putin is not allowing outside observers. The Ukrainian media in Crimea has lost its airspace. It's unable to report. They're going to conduct a farce referendum, and they'll declare at the end of it, which has no reliable international observers, that the people of Crimea voted by majority to either for independence or for annexation by Russia. That's completely unacceptable. Completely.
All right. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst. Mr. Ambassador, many thanks.